been, as you can already figure out, a lot of fun this last week. How many of our volunteers are here right now? I mean, I know some of them are probably resting. It was a great time with a couple hundred kids running around here and everything. And I'm very privileged and honored to be a part of this fellowship here, which really loves its young people and provides an opportunity such as this here. I mean, with the platform and out in the foyer. And VBS time is a time that always gets me really excited about the church at large. Because in a lot of ways, you see the church the way God would have it to be all the time. And that is everybody together, working together, enjoying each other's experience, expressing talents and abilities, and everybody working for a common goal. I mean, that is something that you can't buy that. You know, I mean, you can't pay people for that type of esprit de corps. You can't pay people to give their extra time to come here and to hang out with a lot of little kids. And you ever wonder sometimes why kids have so much energy? You ever wonder that? It's because they take it out of the adults, you know? And that's the way it should be. You know, we want to give back to the next generation. And they are constantly a ball of energy, and they are going. But the great thing about it is being able to see God at work in our little ones. Now, one of the things that I always think about every summer during VBS is you hear some of these songs that the kids sing. And the theme this last week, of course, was Shipwrecked, Jesus Rescues. And on each and every day, there was a particular emphasis. And that was one of the things that I found impressive and made me think a lot. Day one, when you're lonely, when you worry, when you struggle, when you do wrong, and when you're powerless. You know, as I think about those themes, I look at these little ones and I think they are so young and innocent appearing, at very least. And I sometimes think myself, you know, they're singing these songs about when I've made a wreck out of my life and all of these big kind of deep themes. And I think to myself, really? Really? Is that how it's been for them? I mean, are they singing those songs with sincerity and truth? And then I'm reminded of the counsel of the sage of Ecclesiastes. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. And it reminds me that right now with our young people, with our children, is absolutely the best time to teach them these truths that Jesus rescues. Jesus rescues. You know, Jesus is central to our understanding of ourselves as believers. Jesus and his power and ability to be with us through the difficult times, through the challenges of this life. A lot of little ones here have already seen some crazy stuff in their lives. They've already experienced some challenges, difficulties, health concerns, broken families, the anxiety of living in this world. But you know, we've also, as older people, have experienced that as well. And you know, sometimes even though a young person maybe hasn't done something that's spun their world completely off track, off course, for them, they have experienced shipwrecks. And then certainly the older you get, you find these times in life where you really do have these experiences where it feels like everything is a total mess. Now, I know we live in the age of GPS. I mean, you can pull out your phone and you can figure out in a couple of yards, within a couple feet, wherever you may be on the face of this planet. And we have things like radar, and we have things like sonar, and we've got telecommunications. But as we've looked at this last week, I thought about what it must have been like centuries ago. Now, we take it for granted that we can always figure out where we're at. But put yourself in the and a sailboat with sailors 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, when all you had to navigate by were the sun, the moon, and the stars, and maybe a few fixed objects on land. And to think about what it must have taken to be able to go out into that deep water. Now, I remember from back in the fleet, standing on the fantail. That's the back end of the ship, by the way, for those of you wondering what that is. Standing on the fantail, watching as the ship went away from land and seeing that last little dot of something on land dip below the horizon. And then to look around and to see in 360 degrees nothing but the deep blue sea. That's a humbling experience. I mean, yeah, I know we got radar and we've got, as I said, we've got GPS and all those other things, but just to imagine yourself out in a sea that's as vast as the eye can see and know that you are at the absolute mercy of that body of water. It's a humbling thing. And so I can only imagine what it must have been like back in the first century when sailors would get underway. And typically they would stay near the coastline so that you could always keep yourself affixed to the shore. This is why journeys that today would take maybe a day or two would take weeks, if not months, because the craft were constantly keeping themselves always within sight of land. Well, the scriptures tell us in the book of Acts of an occasion where the Apostle Paul was about to get underway on a voyage. Now, the thing is that this was a time when, according to Paul, he had the wisdom to recognize we don't need to believe it. We need to stay exactly where we're at. But you see, Paul had been told, through a prophet that one day he would have an opportunity to take the gospel to Italy. Well, the prophet also informed him that he would be in chains. And so Paul found himself a prisoner about to be taken on board a ship that was setting sail for the Italian peninsula. But it says in Acts chapter 27, verse 9, "Now when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, 'Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives.' Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul." You know, Jesus has the power to rescue us. We recognize that. But have you ever found yourself in a situation where circumstances seem to begin to overwhelm you? Now, in this particular case, Paul is saying to anyone who will listen, we cannot leave here now. It is not safe. We must stay put. But circumstances over which he had no control directed otherwise. And I think about our young people sometimes in the world they're trying to navigate through and recognizing that for some of them, circumstances are of such a nature that they don't have any say over what's going to happen. They're on board the ship and they have to go along. You know, and if it's that way for kids, I know it's that way sometimes for us adults. That sometimes we find ourselves in a predicament where the crowd is saying one thing and we know something else, but we're kind of caught up with things. And it feels really overwhelming. And it says, "Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable in winter, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there." And so they got underway. And I love the way this next part of the passage opens up. And it says, "When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete." Now, has anybody here ever gotten yourself into trouble over a long period of time? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where before you realized it, things were not the way you thought they were going to be? It all started out okay, everything seemed to be going fine, but before you knew it, you were in extremis. Well, that's essentially what Paul is saying here. When they started out their journey, it was a soft, gentle wind. And you know, the reality is for those people who find themselves in a shipwreck right now, I guarantee you did not get up and say, I can't wait to shipwreck my life. You didn't do that. You know, it's like one of those things that, you know, not to make light of it, but I know a lot of people have experienced divorce. You know, and as a pastor, you know, I know what the Bible teaches and everything like that about divorce, but you know the thing that the Bible teaches and that we can observe is that life is difficult. And the truth of the matter is, I have yet to meet a single person who tells me that the day they got married, they had planned in their heart, I'm going to get a divorce. I've never met anybody who says, hey, I can't wait to date somebody just so that we can break each other's hearts and split up a few years from now. Nobody does that. It's always the gentle breezes that carry us along in a direction that we never intended to go that oftentimes present the greatest danger to us. If the storm was raging, if the lightning was crashing, and all of this stuff was going on, they would have never gotten underway. They would have seen the circumstances around it. And see, that's for us as believers, as we try to navigate through life, we have to always be aware of the gentle breezes that are contrary to where we would want our lives to go. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive, and running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. And that's how it is in life, isn't it? Sometimes it just seems like circumstances are so powerful and so overwhelming that all we can do is just go along with it. We find ourselves in a point of alienation within our relationship, and we think to ourselves, there is nothing we can do here except take this to divorce. We find ourselves in a situation where we are drifting along, and we think to ourselves, there's nothing we can do here except give in to this trial. There's nothing that we can do here except just go along with it and break our hearts and compromise in ways that we never dreamed of. You see, that's how it is when the soft wind gives way to the tempestuous wind, when the little things give way to the big things that push us and drive us towards the rocks. And sometimes we just feel so overwhelmed by life that it's kind of like, I'm just going along with it, right? Have you ever been that way, or is it just me? Where you just sometimes you feel like there's no point in trying, there's no point in giving any effort to this, because why? It is always fighting against something that is greater than I. It's always fighting and pushing and struggling and scrapping and scraping, and there's never any progress. And so it was with Paul and the crew on this ship. And the scriptures tell us when they had taken on it on board, in verse 17, they used cables to undergird the ship, fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands. They struck sail, and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. You know, marine archaeologists have found the remnants of various sailing vessels from the first century Roman Empire. And a lot of times people don't realize how large some of these vessels were. A moderate-sized, a medium-sized vessel that was in regular service at this time in the Roman Empire could be as large as a vessel that could hold 175,000 tons of cargo. 175,000 tons of cargo. So we're not talking about little dinghies, we're not talking about little small boats, we're talking about seaworthy vessels. And in all likelihood, this is something probably similar to what Paul found himself on, given the fact that later it's revealed 270 some odd people are on board. This was a vessel that was made to go through the seas, and it was being beaten about, and it was being knocked about, and so it is sometimes with our lives. That we've carefully constructed things, we think we've got a plan, we think everything is going to go the way we expect it, and then the south wind gives way to the tempestuous wind, and we start being pushed along a certain direction, and all of a sudden we have to start jettisoning our plans. You know, the great philosopher Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they get hit. And it's true. And sometimes that's how it is for us in life. We're thinking things are going to go a certain way, but then we get hit. And so what do? We start jettisoning things. We start throwing overboard things. And you know what? There's some wisdom in this, particularly in the first century when you didn't have the same type of ballast control that we have today aboard modern vessels. So what do? You start getting rid of the things that you realize are not going to save you. Maybe there's something in your life you're hanging on to right now that really is not going to save you. Maybe it's some relationship, maybe it's some position, maybe it's some status, maybe it's something in your imagination that you're holding on to, but you realize at the end of the day, it's really not going to save you. You think about you men out there that are so driven by your careers that you sacrifice your family for that next promotion. You think about people who are constantly striving for that next big thing in life. Meanwhile, their lives are running towards the rocks. So there comes a time in our lives that you got to set aside the stuff that's not going to save you. You know, when you're in a situation like this here, you need to do a priority check and realize that maybe, just maybe, there's something more important than what you're holding on to. That's what these circumstances drove the crew of Paul's ship to do, so they start throwing over everything. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood up in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me." Now, you might be tempted to think that this is Paul saying, "I told you so," but it's really not the case. What Paul is doing here is he's appealing to the fact that, listen, I warned you before and you didn't listen to me. So if you'll listen to me now, maybe, just maybe, I'll give you some good counsel. And he says, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. So I would say to you today, listen. You may be on a ship that is headed towards the rocks, and you may be going your own way, but if you will heed the voice of God, you will be saved. Regardless of how far down the track you are, regardless of how far down the course you are, if you will listen now, if you will hear now the voice of the Lord, you will be saved. What was that opening verse that you were provided? It was this: that if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So regardless of what you've believed up until this point, regardless of how you've lived up until this point, that is the everlasting truth. That if you confess Jesus with Lord and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Doesn't mean your ship won't run aground. Doesn't mean that things might not happen bad to you, but it does mean that ultimately you will be delivered. And and sometimes we find ourselves in life where you really get to see just things just laid bare. I remember there was one time, it wasn't like bad seas, but I remember one time coming around from South Carolina down to Key West, and the seas were just ever so gentle. It was glass seas, except for this ever so slight wave action. No white caps, but it was that way for 3 solid days. That was the most miserable seasick I have ever been in my life. Constant up and down and up and down and up and down. I felt worse than I've ever felt in my entire life. And you know how it is sometimes in life where you find yourself feeling worse than you ever have. At that time in life, I would have prayed that the ship would have run aground. I would have prayed for a shipwreck because I just wanted it to end. I just wanted to be on dry ground. You know, and that's funny how it can be with life, that we can be in circumstances that are just so much of a beatdown that running aground is better than what we've got. Now, why do I say that to you? I say that to you to give you encouragement in the sense that, you know, maybe the rocks are coming up fast and maybe there is no way to avoid the collision with the ground. But you know what? Even in that, God can give you relief. Even in the thing that you fear the most, God is there because Jesus rescues. And so it was here with Paul and the men once again aboard this vessel, where he says to them, in verse 21, it goes on, but after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island.'" Now, I'm not going to suggest to you that fate has so woven its binds around you that there's no hope for tomorrow. But what I'm saying to you is, if you should be heading towards the rocks, don't worry, because God has the power to deliver you. And he says to the men, listen, bad things are going to happen, but you will be delivered. And I think there's a similar sentiment expressed by Jesus when he says to us, in this world you will have troubles, but rejoice, for I have overcome the world. So if you're here on a ship that's headed towards the rocks, I want you to know God is with you and that Jesus rescues. Even if that bad thing happens, even if you get that report back this next week that says, yeah, it's positive, you have cancer. Even if you get that notice by the process server that they're going through with the divorce. Even if you get that notice that the bankruptcy is certain, Jesus rescues. He will rescue you. Now, we will pray against those things, we will hope against those things, but the reality is that for a believer underway, Jesus rescues regardless of what comes upon us. He has promised this. And so it goes on to say here, "Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land, and they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. That's about 120 feet, by the way, for those who are interested in a little nautical terminology there. And when they'd gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you.' And when he had said these things, he took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. So let me ask you this here. For those who are sensing that the rocks are coming up fast, when's the last time you gave thanks? That's not to induce any type of guilt in you. I'm not trying to suggest you should feel bad if you haven't given thanks. I'm trying to suggest to you what you should be doing from this point forward. Give thanks. Give thanks. You've already been lamenting your predicament, haven't you? I mean, people ask me sometimes, they ask about, how much Bible study is appropriate. Anybody ever say, meditating on the Word of God? How do you meditate on the Word of God? Well, you already know how to meditate. Do you worry? Okay, if you worry about something, you know what it means to meditate. It's as simple as that. If you're worried about something, you are meditating on that thing. So I would suggest it's probably based on human habits, my own personal habits to begin with, and what I've observed in others, that if you sense that the rocks are coming up, you probably have already spent a fair amount of time worrying about it. Haven't you? So why don't you do something different? What's worrying done for you? Absolutely nothing. You're still getting closer to the rocks. Disaster's still approaching. What's worrying doing? Hasn't stopped it, hasn't slowed it down, so you might as well give thanks. No thanks for the rocks, but thanks for God's certain deliverance. Thanks that God is going to get you through no matter what happens in the next few hours, next few days, next few months, next few years. God is going to deliver you because Jesus rescues. That's what he does. He has always rescued you, and he will always rescue you. Okay? You know it's the truth. How do you know it's the truth? You're sitting here alive, aren't you? So whatever Jesus has done up until this point has gotten you to this point. So you might as well give thanks to God, trusting in him that he's going to be faithful to how he's been in the past, that he's going to continue to deliver you. Doesn't mean the rocks aren't going to come, doesn't mean that the ship's not going to run aground, doesn't mean that bad things aren't going to happen, but you have already seen for yourself that God will deliver. And so it says here, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile losing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion wanted to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. God can take the refuse of your life. He can take the things that are broken and use them for your deliverance. He can. Okay? It's not his plan. It's not his desire that you go through needless suffering. It is not his interest that you go through a lot of the hardships that you go through. But Jesus will take the broken parts of your life and he will use them for your deliverance. And now when they had escaped, they then found out that the island was called Malta, and the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. So when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow him to live." That to me would have been worse than being at sea. That's how I am about snakes. I would have rather taken my chance out on the seas than to have to deal with a snake. But then they're looking at him and they're saying, listen, this guy has got to be the worst of the worst. And that's how it seems to happen. So this is one of those things. I think everybody's accepted it. When it's bad, what's going to happen next? Something worse. Okay? When is it going to get better? When it gets better. Okay? But until it gets better, what's going to happen? It's going to get worse. I mean, I don't know if I'm an optimist, a pessimist, or a realist. Okay? But the reality is, even if it seems to get worse, Let's see what it says here. But he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. I want you to take this very carefully to heart. Your ship has run aground. You found yourself shipwrecked. Things get worse. But to go with the words of that modern poet, Taylor Swift, shake it off. Okay? Because you can do that in Christ. You can. Just as Paul shook off that serpent, so you can shake off whatever this thing is that's threatening you right now. Whatever this thing is that's got you fearful and afraid, you can, by the power of God, shake it off. Not saying it's easy, okay? I don't think the serpent just gave itself up. But with the power of God and the fact that Jesus rescues, we can shake off the things of this life that threaten us, the things of this life that make us fearful, the things of this life that take away our peace. We can do this. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they looked at him for a long time and so saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and they said he was a god. Look how suddenly circumstances, fortunes change. And I would say the same is true for you today. Things can change in an instant. In an instant, that which has gotten you to a place of desperation, God can use to save you. And when things have gotten worse, God can give you the power to be delivered. Why? Because Jesus rescues.